Good morning. Very happy to see everyone reasonably bright and early here, and welcome to Singapore. May I just know for how many of you are non-resident in Singapore? Oh, lovely. Anyway, if it's your first time, welcome, and if you're back, welcome again. And it gives me great pleasure because a lot of my talk really is to share a little bit about Singapore. I love the theme, Paul, called Tomorrow, because we are going to face many challenges. And today I'm really going to share some thoughts from a city perspective. I know there are many architects here, but I'm an architect planner, so I thought I'll start with the macro picture. Now, how will the future physical landscape unfold for us? Because the city sets the context for the architects. And today I'm going to talk particularly the context of Singapore, which really shares a lot of the same challenges as many other cities. I'm just going to highlight 4 critical drivers of urban change, and I'm going to just run through them, and to also look at the implications for us, especially as architects and designers and planners and people who deal with the built environment. The first driver is about resource shifts and cliffs. The world is really in the midst of a triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste. In the past 50 years, our global consumption of resources has tripled. Global extraction of raw materials is expected to increase by 60% by 2060 from 2020 levels. And this will drive increasing damage, carbon emissions, and risk. So we really need to build smarter in a way that reduces raw materials, to reduce carbon emission, to save the energy that is needed, and even to shift our diets to reduce food waste and reduce land needed for food production. So there's a lot to think about to rethink systems. How do we consume smarter, create more with less for everyone? These problems are multifold exacerbated for Singapore, which have no natural resources. We only have a land of about 734 square kilometers. What is that? That's only about half the size of metropolitan London, but we are a country, we're not a city. And there are lots of challenges, and key for us is resource resilience. Do we have enough land, energy, water, and food? Really quite basic, right? But let's just have a look at land. If you look at Singapore, we've urbanized quite a bit over the last couple of decades. And right now, we are about middle age, with more land urbanized, and more sites will be brownfield. Development will come from brownfield sites. So the challenge is, how do we create a virtuous cycle of land stock for future generations? And how do we ensure water, energy, and food security? Well, next, the world is far from achieving the global goal of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The collective international climate change action will compel us to live in a carbon-constrained world. To hold 2 degrees increase by 2050, we need a 64% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to 2019. To limit the increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050, we need an 84% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Looks such an impossible task. In 2 weeks' time, I'll be in Baku, Azerbaijan, and there'll be a lot of talk shop, but I don't know how much action will be taken. So we really have to work very hard on this. And Singapore has, even though we're very tiny, we have committed to achieving net zero by 2050. But for us to achieve this is really, really not so easy. So it's very challenging, even though we set ourselves that goal. But actually let me just do that. Our city is also aging. There is what I call a global aging challenge. Globally, our populations are rapidly getting older, except for parts like the African continent. And Singapore is aging very rapidly. We will be super aged in 6 years' time, very fast, with 1 in 4 being 65 years old. And this rate will accelerate to 1 in 3 by 2050. So you will see a lot of us aging by the time you come in 6 years' time. And of course, with that are many challenges: rising needs and costs for healthcare, support for the elderly, and how do we achieve healthy, purposeful, and productive longevity? But our city is also aging, not just us, the human beings. Our city infrastructure is getting older, and according to a Global Infrastructure Hub, the world is going to face a 15 trillion gap between projected investment and the amount needed to provide adequate global infrastructure by 2040. And there are some interesting statistics. US infrastructure was recently rated D+ overall for infrastructure. 85% of EU buildings were built before the year 2000, and among those, 75% have a poor energy performance. And I'm told that in Italy, some 300 bridges are at risk of collapse. And there is a lot of power plants in Europe and other places with load shedding problems. I was in Cape Town last year, and this was a huge problem. In Singapore, our infrastructure is also aging. An estimated 50 to 60% of Singapore's existing infrastructure will be over half a century by 2040. And by 2050, some 33% of our public housing buildings will be 70 years old. And 80% of the people in Singapore live in public housing. So I think we have to deal with increased prevalence of physical and functional deterioration and obsolescence, and also deal with stranded assets. Finally, one big change is we have to cater to new economic models. The world has changed with technology, digitalization, and with the advent of AI coming on. Everything changes. Live, work, play, learn. So how do we deal with that? And there are changing priorities and lifestyles of people. Right now, the jury is out on whether the remote working is going to stay that way, because all the bosses say you better come back or you'll be fired. But the rest of us would love to work from home. But we will see this changing, and there's been a big impact on real estate and commercial nodes and new ways of working and new ways of living. So how do we make our cities relevant and continue to be attractive? I think that's going to be the big challenge. Now, for Singapore, we have a long-term planning process to try and deal with all these uncertainties. And we have a long-term plan that we work on every 5 to 10 years. It has a 30, 40-year planning horizon, and it's a very broad structured plan, although we have very detailed plans. But we have to change the way we are planning. The process has to change because of the uncertainty and volatility going ahead. So instead of doing specific plans, we now look at planning different scenarios. And I actually advocate we should look even at 100 years. I know a lot of people think it's impossible, but I'll explain why a little later. So at the planning level, as the complexity of urban issues and the pace of change have increased, planning projections for Singapore's long-term plan have evolved. We have to be preemptive and take a scenario-based approach. Urban planners have to consider multiple pathways and project a range of possibilities, not one plan. What if this happens? What if this happens? And we have to put in place signposts that will help to trigger reviews and decisions down the road. And these signposts are really metrics that we need to know, affecting the economy, health, social attitudes, social changes, demographic changes. We need to know these metrics because they raise red flags for us to know that we need to change. And no one single plan can stay the same forever. So it's a very important consideration. Signposting, and we have to scan outliers and emerging trends. So for Singapore, our development going forward would largely be brownfield, probably 80% of brownfield sites. But they provide new opportunities for rejuvenation at scale. And we have many projects. For those who are a little bit more familiar with Singapore, we have multiple ideas for rejuvenation. We are going to move the Paya Lebar Air Base. We have moved the port, the city port to the west, which free us up the entire Greater Southern Waterfront for new development. So we're going to build a new Tuas port. And we have many other large swaths of land that we can rejuvenate. So while we say we have no land, we do have land if we plan very well. So another idea is that land use flexibility can also provide very, very strong flexibility in the way which we plan the city. Where you are now in Marina Bay, we first introduced the idea of the white zone. And the white zone actually allows the developer to put multiple users as needs change over time. Although the Urban Redevelopment Authority will stipulate a minimum component of specific use or specific users to meet its planning intentions. So we will introduce more flexibility into zoning. I think architects don't like the word zoning because it restricts what they can do, neither do developers. So the idea is to introduce more flexibility into zoning. And for instance, we will explore vertical zoning in our industrial estates, which can integrate complementary uses. For example, you can have clean industries on the ground floor, and in the mid-floors, you could have co-working spaces which buffer residential housing above. So that is possible. Other ideas for land use flexibility is we have a business-wide zone which allows industrial developments to have greater proportion of non-industrial users. So you can integrate the entire business value chain as well as complementary amenities within the development and adding co-working spaces, retail, food and beverage. But we are also looking at enterprise districts which allow a large master developer like the Jurong Town Corporation to use spaces across the district instead of being subject to existing development rules for each site. So this supports holistic planning and mixed uses. Now, so we talk a little bit about planning processes. But in addition to the process, our priorities need to change and to be reconsidered. Traditionally, we are very preoccupied, especially in Singapore with very little land. We're preoccupied with safeguarding and optimizing land and sea space and create livable environments. This is a very common planning objective across most cities. But I think we need new urban lexicon and vocabulary going forward. We now need to think about regenerative thinking, resource resilience. Our growth needs to be sustainable. Can we think circularity as a principle? Can we steward nature? How do we build a healthy and high urban quality in our cities? These become new ideas and new priorities in the planning of cities. So, what is regenerative thinking and regenerative design? I think most of you know what it is. In very simple language, it is just about shifting from doing less bad to doing more good, and regenerative design is about achieving net positive outcomes. Not so easy to do, but the idea is that we must restore and rebalance our relationship with nature. We need to design a future where buildings are net positive, where infrastructure increases biodiversity, where urban planning restores natural ecosystems, and so forth. So there needs to be a paradigm shift in our thinking. Actually, it's not enough to just be sustainable, but actually to do a lot more and look at regenerative actions which can take place across different scales, cross-scale, national scale, cities, neighborhoods, and buildings. I won't go into this because in itself is a very huge topic, but the point is we need to shift our mind forward, going forward. So resource resilience, particularly for Singapore, is so important. And especially in finding land, how do we create space in a very innovative way? We have already tried many things, right? Reclamation, we have developed underground spaces, we built polders, just like in the Netherlands. But going forward, other ideas are important, like multifunctionality as a principle. So let me just give an example. Singapore is very low-lying. and being a city-state and an island, we are in danger of sea level rise. So we need to protect our coast. So we have already planned ahead to develop and reclaim this long island, which is about 15 kilometers long, about 800 hectares large. And the idea is it will protect the entire low-lying East Coast. But it is the way that we will have to do it in a very multifunctional way. This land, the way we reclaim, will not only be for housing, recreation users, but we will also reclaim it in such a way that it can store water. So you notice that the land doesn't take up all the space. We create a new basin for storing fresh water. So I will talk a little bit about water in my next slide. Water is existential to Singapore. We need water to survive. So we've worked very hard to close the water loop. So this is the idea of resource resilience. And to do that, we rely on 4 taps. One is imported water. We do import water traditionally from Malaysia as one big source, but you can appreciate that Malaysia too will need water. We cannot rely on that forever. So the second tap is domestic sources, new water and desalinated water, which I will walk you through. Domestic sources means that you pray very hard and it rains. Actually, in the tropics, there is water. But why is it that people say they don't have enough water? The key is that we are not collecting efficiently. There is water, but we're not collecting it. So in Singapore, we've done it in such a way that it's really a sponge city. 2/3 of Singapore is water catchment. And we will increase this to 90%. So everything that falls down, we collect. We collect everything. But if you collect, you need to store it. So in tiny Singapore, we have 17 reservoirs. So all the inland water bodies and rivers are converted to freshwater reservoir. A very good example is right here in Marina Bay. When we reclaimed the land, we built a barrage and we created the largest freshwater reservoir in a city, probably in the world, because we collect everything that falls, right? Another idea is really new water. We recycle all used water. So maybe you had a drink of water in Singapore. Guess what? You might be drinking a lot of other stuff too. But don't worry, we only put very little of recycled water back into the reservoirs. Most of it, it's so clean that it's used for industry in, for example, wafer fab production. But what is interesting is that to recover the water, everything, right, from what you flush to what you wash, we have introduced this idea called the deep tunnel sewage system. The DTSS is about a 200-kilometer massive superhighway for water, 15 stories deep underground in Singapore. Through gravity fall, we collect everything into the water reclamation plants that are placed underground, and the water is processed and purified into new water. Of course, we also do desalination, but this is one of our newest desalination plants. Is right in the middle of a park. So again, the idea of multifunctionality. Underneath are a lot of pump rooms, but above is for recreation. It's a beautiful park. You can go there, you can jog, you can run. So this idea of multiple users of infrastructure with recreation and other users is very much in our DNA when we design and plan. But while we've closed the water loop, we have a new problem. It's energy. Because to desalinate and to use membrane technology to recycle water, you need energy. And we don't have energy. We import almost everything. So what we've done is we have tried to strengthen the wastewater and energy nexus. So what we have done in one of the latest state-of-the-art infrastructure is to co-locate the Tuas Water Reclamation Plant with the Integrated Waste Management Facility. In Singapore, how do we deal with waste? We have no place to chuck our waste, We only have one landfill offshore. Everything is incinerated, but you still have the ash after you incinerate, right? So when we incinerate, we generate heat, the heat drives the water reclamation plant. But when you reclaim water, sludge is left over. The sludge is converted to biogas that in turn generates electricity for the incineration plant. So here the idea of circularity becomes very important to close the loop for energy. And yet you are now using energy to create water, but you are using water to create energy. So I think these ideas of circularity are absolutely important for all cities. We have 4 taps for water, but we have 4 switches for energy. We do import a lot of gas. We are mounting solar panels everywhere, but we are also tapping into regional power grids in ASEAN to buy energy for Singapore. In fact, there is a private company that's going to put solar panels in Australia, and they're going to pipe all the energy all the way to Singapore, the clean energy just generated. We're also looking at emerging low carbon alternatives, green hydrogen, for example, and carbon capture. And of course, we need solar panels. It's probably the most viable for us, so we're putting them everywhere. We even float them on the water in the reservoirs. This is one of the largest floating reservoirs for solar panels in the world. Okay, I also want to say that we continue to try and innovate. So how do we double our water supply by 2060 without using more energy or producing more waste? So we are looking at new technologies like electro-deionization technology using biometric membranes. They use a lot less energy. And we are going to increase the new water production and increase the energy self-sufficiency level. So it's all about innovation, and it's all about adopting technology that is highly innovative, that can solve our problems. So we have to work very hard at this. And of course, food. While we import food, we try to have self-sufficient in nutrient needs in some of the food that we have in Singapore. So we are converting a lot of roof gardens to urban farms. We are integrating the idea of urban farms in the way we plan our towns. And of course, resource resilience and circular material flow ideas applies a lot of planning. So for example, we have this industrial estate whereby we are going to place different types of users together that can feed into each other. So you can have food manufacturing together with environmental tech and biosciences together, because one company's waste can then feed into another company as a material use. So you can do that through, again, the use of urban planning. So very quickly, city structures are important to mitigate very high densities. And of course, city structures, we have adopted 3 ideas. One is polycentricity, and we are highly transit-oriented, which means that we have decentralized a lot of our commercial nodes outside of the city area, very well served by public transit. So this reduces congestion into the city, and it reduces the need for cars to move around and emit carbon emissions. So we have a very dense rail network, and almost 80% of homes will be within a 10-minute walk from a mass rapid transit station by 2030. We're almost there. A lot of the lines have already been built. So we are seeing less people needing to own a car. And a significant feature of our long-term plans is to integrate the green and blue into the environment. This is how we mitigate the very high density in Singapore. We're probably one of the densest cities in the world. But we have many parks. We have 360 parks. Actually, you're within a 10-minute walk to a park. And we link up all the parks with park connectors. It gives you the perception of space, because you can go from park to park. You can actually cycle 150 kilometers, even though it's a very tiny Singapore. And you can do that park to park, coast to coast. And in addition to park, it's about stewarding nature. Right in the heart of Singapore is actually a primary forest. And if you are visiting Singapore for the first time, one place I would recommend that you go is go to the zoo, because the zoo is there. The night safari is there. The bird paradise is there in this virgin tropical forest right in the heart of a very, very dense city. And what we do is we link up all the nature areas that we've protected with eco corridors, because these become corridors in which animals and bird life and biodiversity can move from place to place. We too need to create virtual space and the sense of space for them. So Singapore stewards nature. Our concept is about having a city in nature, not just a garden city. So we're bringing back biodiversity into the city. Now, if you walk along Marina Bay, there are families or otters who live there. You might actually spot them. So, and actually in the gardens by the bay, which is next to this development, please take time to visit it, because it is also a bird sanctuary. A lot of people go there to observe the birds. We have Changi Airport, so we're a hub, right? An airport, a good airport, and people transit here. But actually, many of the birds transit here too. They transit from Europe to Singapore to Australia. So we also create transit stops for them. But as we use up our land, we start to bring greenery towards the sky. So we have this program called LUSH, called the Landscaping for Urban Spaces and High Rises. We incentivize the developers to bring greenery up to the sky and create new recreation spaces. So for example, in Marina Bay, the requirement is that as you build, you remove your footprint, you have to put 100% greenery replacement in the sky. But architects have become so creative that most of them now replace more than 100% of the footprint that is used up, sometimes as much as twice or even 3 times through very, very clever design. So we must thank the architects for the creativity. And we have also converted many of our concrete drains into naturalized streams. And these streams, they are used as nature-based solutions for floodplains. And so therefore, it also adds greenery back into the towns and the cities. So here again, it's multifunctional. It's a park, it's also a floodplain, but it brings a lot of green and blue into the city. So if you look at Arab's Global Sponge Cities snapshot in 2023, it calculates a city's natural absorbency from its green and blue spaces using Terrain, which is an AI tool that digests large quantities of data and satellite imagery. I think this was developed by Arab to help enhance nature-based infrastructure. So Singapore was ranked 3rd out of 10 cities in its sponge percentage, despite being a very high-density built-up city. So it is possible to bring nature in. Now, very quickly, Professor Ian Golding, in his book on the age of the city, postulates that as cities compete in the next few decades, unfortunately, only some cities will be the star cities. So if cities want to do well, they must have that high urban quality to attract and to retain talent. At the same time, companies are actually drawn to invest in cities that have ample talent. So unfortunately, it's almost only a very handful of cities that will do very well, and we have to work hard at being one of those cities. So a key strategy is, of course, to develop high urban quality. So we continue to rejuvenate our city constantly, all the time, injecting new mixed-use neighborhoods, having a health and wellness focus, enhancing the CBD and commercial nodes, and great placemaking. So within the city, I'm not going to go into detail, we are going to develop new areas for rejuvenation. This is Pearls Hill, which will introduce another 6,000 new homes into the area. Marina South, which is just next to us, will be new, lively, mixed-use neighborhoods with super low energy buildings, with health being a very major consideration in the design. 10-minute neighborhoods, very walkable and highly sustainable in its design and construction. Now, it is really also about rejuvenating the city. Let me try and get back. Right. In the CBD, we all have downtowns and we worry that the downtowns will deteriorate. So we introduced a lot of incentive schemes, like the Central Business District Incentive Scheme that encourage older buildings to be rejuvenated for mixed users. We have the Strategic Development Incentive Scheme that encourage developers to get together. So it's not just a single project, but maybe with your neighboring projects, and together you do a much larger scale, massive redevelopment. So you also see that there's now a lot more housing in our CBD, which previously was quite dead after in the evening because there's not enough housing, but now more housing has come back. And really it's also about creating delightful spaces. I mean, I'm preaching to the converted here, or the architects. Placemaking is absolutely essential to have a vibrant city. I'm going to run through very quickly because I've run out of time. I want to talk about public housing. In Singapore, almost 80% of the people live in public housing. Now, that is the real Singapore. The real Singapore is not Marina Bay. So if you have some time and Paul lets you off, 2 hours or so, take a train, visit any of the public housing towns. It's called the Housing Development Board towns because it's developed by HDB, the Housing and Development Board. That is the real Singapore, and that's how people live. And our conception of public housing in many cities is that it's run down, it deteriorates, but our towns are actually quite vibrant and quite decent. So I encourage you to visit. And going forward, the public housing towns keep getting rejuvenated, and new generation towns have themes of living well, living green, and living connected. Now, these are the types of designs we do for public housing towns, particularly the new generation towns. The quality is good, it's almost as good as your mass market condominiums, so very good quality, and it's important. The way we plant, we bring in biophilic principles, also this whole idea of regenerative cities, right? The way we plant is to bring health benefits to the residents. We have lots of parks, therapeutic parks, educative parks, and parks for people with dementia. And this is to promote mental wellness. And health and wellness will be a big theme for the design of these new towns. Now, this is a real project. We put running tracks on top of the multi-story car parks, and we are going to fit in motivators and nudges for people to move, when you're living in the town for better health. And a lot of it's mixed use. We're introducing a lot of mixed users into the neighborhood centers where you have healthcare facilities, shops, eating facilities, and they are gathering points for social wellness and strengthening community bonds. A lot of activities take place in these neighborhood centers. And as the population age, we introduce new ideas for housing. So this is a new form of housing called for assisted living, called the community care apartments. And you have here people are still healthy, but they might need help with 1 or 2 of the physical activities. They might need someone to cook for them, or they might need to have a bath. Somebody needs to help them with a bath. So they live here in a community, in smaller flats, but with a lot of areas for interaction, but they can subscribe for services to help take care of them. So we have the concept of aging in place, trying to get people to age where they live. And there is continuous rejuvenation. We go back and retrofit and fit out our towns, and we have the remaking of heartland programs. We even fit out the interior of the flat. When it has aged, we retrofit the new toilets. There is a co-sharing with the Housing and Development Board. You pay some, but actually the government pays the majority of it. We go back and rejuvenate the neighborhoods, and we even rejuvenate all the shops. This is a topic of its own. I have no time. I'm only showing one slide, but if you have time, visit the Public Housing and Development Board. They have a great gallery that explains all the proposals that they do. Finally, it's about building green buildings. I'm not going to go through in detail. It's important, but I want to encourage architects to think about the way we design. Here I'm talking about building level, not city level. Can we design buildings that are flexible? This is a great example done by Haptic and Rembor, where the building in Oslo is designed as 3-story high structural decks. That's a structural frame. So the idea is that you can renovate the building. You don't have to demolish everything because there's so much flexibility built into the building. So these are some ideas that we should be thinking about as we now develop new buildings so that we don't have to pull them down and they can be retrofitted. It's also about an ethos of sustainability from the outside in. And Matrix 1 is an example in Amsterdam. The facade really features an aluminum cladding, and they're screwed directly onto wooden facades for easy disassembly. So the idea really is you want to save materials and you want to be able to reuse the materials, which leads me to this point. It's about circular construction. We need continuous and circular flow of materials that can be recycled, and which leads to the idea of material passports. There is a need for a lot more research on how to track building materials that are used in a building. There's some research being done in Singapore, and you can actually track the materials, develop almost an inventory for every building of the material. So if the building needs to be pulled down, then you can recover these materials. And this material should be made known to people. You could actually buy from this building that's pulling down so you can recycle. I think there needs to be some movement towards this in the entire construction industry. So also it's about moving from net zero to net positive. So that's the challenge for us all architects. Can we think of ways to move from net zero to net positive? We have started in some way, but we're a long way to go. And finally, I advocate the use of science and technology to help us. Singapore is no stranger to the use of science and technology. We have no choice. We have to be innovative to deal with our to improve our resilience. So whether it's for planning, for example, we do use a lot of data to help us plan. And now is to bring in the use of AI to help us to project, to predict, to run scenarios. So the use of technology is going to be much, much more important going forward, whether it's for urban planning or in your designs. I think there's a lot of you who might already be using AI for computational generation of designs, right? Multiple options, and each option you're able to tell what is your carbon footprint and urban heat that you're generating. So this all helps designers. We can use this as enablers. So that's my last slide. I think the objective is really for us to work together to build a better tomorrow. But we have to be very conscious of what we need to do and very conscious in our design. Thank you. Do we have
Well, what a lovely way to start this conference session with a very rich mix of a cake there. And I think people who know Singapore a bit have always been intrigued by the extent to which, despite it being a very free market economy, it's combined that with aspects of a socialist state-run system, especially in respect of housing provision. Was this something that was always anticipated at the start of Singapore after independence in 65, that would be the way to go? Was that what Lee Kuan Yew envisaged?
Yeah. For those who don't know, Lee Kuan Yew was the founding Prime Minister of Singapore. Well, I think Singapore has always used a mix of, you're absolutely right, Paul, it's a use of a mix of a capitalist system for social good. And I think it's an issue of governance. In fact, I just gave a talk on governance. That's another subject. Good governance is absolutely important in ensuring good transformation of the city. So because you lack the resources, you have to be very clever in the use of regulation, the use of incentives and disincentives, but to nudge the capitalist private sector to deliver good, social good. So let me give an example. Marina Bay, all right? I say Marina Bay because we're all in it. When we develop Marina Bay, the government doesn't build the building. We plan it, we support it with infrastructure, we put our money where our mouth is to give confidence by investing in the infrastructure. But the land is actually sold to the private sector to tap on their resources, their ideas, and their energy to build. Marina Bay Sands is one of them. I was the one who worked on this project to encourage bidders to bid for the land, but at the same time, we have to deal with the not so good. For example, we really had huge debates on whether we want a casino here, all right? Because Singapore had never had a casino. And we did, but myself, being the urban planner, trying to put a casino right in the middle of the city in the CBD is quite a horrifying thought. And I must tell you, when the first ideas came in as a dry run, all the casino operators came up with really bad designs, very kitsch, sorry, like Las Vegas. So that's no go, right? So we had to develop, and the brief for the tender is this thick. I had to develop a brief that encourages good international architecture. And if you look around, do you see the sign of a casino anywhere? You don't, because that's one of the requirements. So the casino is actually in the basement, and only when you enter, you realize it's there. But we work with the developer to provide a lot of public spaces to enhance Marina Bay. So if you stay this evening, you will see a very nice light show on the water. There are lots of public spaces all around Marina Bay, and we work very closely with the developer's architect to mesh the infrastructure with their requirements, and they have to give back something to the city for social good. I was very fortunate that this building, in the end, when we selected the design, the architect was Moshe Safdie. And Moshe is an urbanist. So he actually designed this building from an urbanist point of view rather than from an architecture point of view. I could talk so much about this building. So if you walk along the waterfront, any developer would double load and put all the shops there. But if you walk out and you walk along the other side, you know, where the convention center is, it's all glass and there's a direct connection to the city. Now, all this came about through a lot of discussion with Moshe, and Moshe understood our requirement to make sure the building is not inward looking but connects to the city, both physically and visually. So I'm just citing this as one example of a lot of work that the government has to work with the private sector to achieve an outcome which is a win-win for both. So just a small example.
Just a quick observation that the ideas that Singapore is putting into effect, many of these had sort of long histories. For example, the greening of buildings and provision of sort of 100% plus replacement of land were sort of ideas that were pioneered by the Malaysian architect Ken Yang as a student thesis project in late 60s, early 1970s, which people thought he was a curiosity at the time, certainly in Cambridge University Architecture School, and it was just sort of Ken doing his thing, and that's the sort of thing somebody from the tropics would do, but it didn't have much relevance to anybody else. But now actually everybody's doing it.
It's become mainstream.
The other thing is that I wonder whether you've been able to look at any examples of urban planning that had envisaged timescales of perhaps a century. I mean, I was thinking of one, when the festival was in Amsterdam, we looked at the 1920s Amsterdam plan, and actually, in spatial terms, it was remarkably prescient. I mean, it kind of worked as a set of principles, and I wonder whether in your potential 100-year plan, can you find things in Singapore's own planning history thus far which make you think you could extend to that period of time?
Well, cities don't change overnight. So the structure of the city generally, it's not so easy to change once it's in place, right? Whether it's Amsterdam or Paris or London. There are certain structures
and spines that once you've put in, and very huge infrastructure, for example, your mass rapid transit network, once you put it in, it's very difficult to change. We were fortunate that in the 1960s, when we were very poor and this place was a real slum, we had some help from the United Nations, and they had a couple of urban planners who came and broadly structured Singapore. And that's why we retained the virgin forest, the tropical forest, right in the heart of the city. And most things are built around it. Now, that structure has remained. But when I talk about rejuvenation and 100 years, it's because if you only have this piece of land, the only way you can redevelop is to change, right? Whatever you have on site. If you take a very short-term view of even 30 years, to me is very short, you will find yourself very constrained, because when your land is used up, 80% used up, you cannot move, right? But if you think in terms of 100 years, even an airport would have run through its economic and physical obsolescence after several decades. You can pull it down. It frees your mind up to bigger ideas, right? The port, I was involved in the discussion of the port more than 20 years ago, and at that time everybody said, we're not moving the port. Can you imagine moving the port? You've invested so much in it, you have deep water there naturally, why do you want to move the port? But as the city became urbanized, you need the land. But lo and behold, we are moving the port into this new generation port that is really state-of-the-art. And why? Because first, there's an economic need. The port has run its course of its economic life. We need the land, and it's about technology. You can now reclaim land 20, 30 over meters deep. The technology is there, but maybe 30 years ago, it would have been very expensive to do it. So it just made sense to move the port. Now, if we didn't think very long term, we would have said, we can't do this, we can't do this. But I think if you think very long term, you can have a better ambition and aspirations, and you're not afraid to change. That's my argument for a 100-year plan. I don't think everyone will agree with me, but I think in a case like Singapore, I think it's absolutely important to have those aspirations.
Well, it's interesting parallels from various other cities that ended up moving their own ports and all their meat and fish markets and their airports. And it's almost like, well, where would be the best place for this rather than the place that was historically convenient, 100 or 200 years ago? I wanted to ask a very quick question about the sort of combination. Let's say you showed that slide of the canal, the concrete canal, yes, which you could say was a very basic engineering response to water. But then it gets transformed via landscape architecture as well as engineering into something delightful. And that seemed to be a sort of parallel running through that, although much of the real change that you're introducing is engineering and sort of biologically led, you might say, it doesn't mean that as a result that you ignore the kind of built environment outcomes and aesthetic that flows from that.
Yeah, it looks so deceptively simple, right? To naturalize the canal. But let me say that it was a huge battle with the engineers. I think most of the people here might be architects, because they do not believe in it. Because a canal, it just looks more efficient, and from an engineering point of view. It took us a long time to convince the engineers. But when we do, you get a really great outcome, right? That you can do both. It's multifunctional, right? As long as you design it well. Yeah.
I think in conclusion, I'd like to refer back to a brilliant polemic exhibition at the Venice Biennale a few years ago, where Singapore didn't have a permanent pavilion at the time. It does now, but it staged a brilliant fringe event, and it was called 1,000 Singapores. And the proposition was that if you took the entire global population at that time, it'd be slightly different now, and you applied Singapore's housing densities, how many of these tiny, tiny cities would you need around the world to house the entire global population? And conveniently, the answer was 1,000, which represented, I don't know, 0.01 of the world's land area. And I think what was so brilliant about that was that, first, the mathematics couldn't be denied. And secondly, although it sort of sounded as though Singapore would be dense housing and nothing else, the reality is quite different because there's a tropical forest in the middle of it, and increasingly it becomes greener and greener and greener. And I think this is why people looking at city development around the world are so intrigued by what's happened in Singapore, because whether the ideas are entirely original isn't really the point. I mean, ideas come and flow and there's cross-fertilization. The real point is that you're actually doing it in a very systematic way, which appears to be able to combine policy formation, engineering requirements, and yet a kind of imaginative overlay of architecture, particularly of the mixed-use, non-zonal variety, and landscape architecture, of course, including water architecture, if I could put it like that. So, you know, I think people who know Singapore are just fantastic admirers of it. And I think your presentation, and indeed your personal contribution over recent decades to the ongoing story of Singapore's success, are much to be admired. So, Chong Koon Heen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone for listening. Thank you.